The shadow that whispers. Have you ever felt like something in your life is off? You can't quite explain it. You plan, you reflect, you push forward, but something invisible keeps pulling you back into the same patterns, the same mistakes, the same invisible wall. Maybe it shows up as anger, sudden and explosive, and afterward, you don't even know what triggered it. Or maybe it's that sharp sting of envy you pretend isn't there. When someone else achieves exactly what you've secretly longed for, it might be subtle, a quiet voice that whispers, "Don't try too hard. You'll only fail." A voice that sounds eerily like your own, but it's not. And then it happens again. Another missed opportunity. Another relationship sabotaged. Another project left unfinished right before the breakthrough. And you're left wondering, why does this keep happening to me? What if the answer isn't in the external world? What if the real force holding you back is coming from inside? Carl Jung called it the shadow, the hidden side of your psyche that stores everything you've denied, rejected, or buried just to be accepted. Your suppressed anger, your abandoned desires, your unspoken fears, all waiting in the dark, not to disappear, but to influence, to control. If you don't face it, it doesn't go away. It simply learns to wear your voice, and it becomes harder and harder to tell who's really making the choices in your life. So the question is, if this isn't you, then who is it? Who is writing your story from behind the curtain? To answer that, we need to enter a deeper space, one most people spend their lives avoiding, a place Jung believed was the true root of all self-sabotage, fear, and internal conflict. The shadow. The birth of the shadow, how you became divided. The shadow doesn't just appear one day. It's formed layer by layer over time, built from everything you were told not to be. From the very first years of life, you began receiving the rules of belonging. Be quiet, be good, smile on command, don't cry, don't talk back, don't need too much. Every time you followed the rules, you were praised. And every time you disobeyed, you were punished, ignored, shamed, or made to feel small. You learned quickly, some emotions are acceptable, others are dangerous. Some parts of you are welcomed, others must be hidden. And so the process began. A quiet, invisible betrayal, not of others, but of yourself. You started to disconnect from your raw, instinctual parts. Your anger tucked away, your desire minimized, your sadness laughed at, your need to be seen framed as arrogance. But here's the truth. Those parts didn't disappear. They were simply pushed out of the light. They went underground into the unconscious, into the shadow. Jung called this psychic exile the birth of the personal shadow, a psychological container for all the thoughts, feelings, and urges we disown to stay accepted, not because we are weak, but because we are wired for attachment. As children, survival depends on approval. So when you were faced with a choice between being real or being loved, you chose love because you had to. But this choice comes at a cost you're likely still paying. Psychologists refer to this process as emotional amputation, the internal cutting off of living aspects of the psyche. Imagine numbing a limb just to keep others comfortable. Now, imagine doing that with your joy, with your rage, with your sexuality, with your ambition. You didn't lose these parts. You buried them. And what is buried becomes shadow. You carry this hidden material everywhere you go into your relationships, your career, your self-image. And most of the time, you don't even know it's there, because the shadow doesn't operate in the daylight of awareness. It moves in whispers. It acts through impulses, projections, and compulsions. And it often wears a very convincing mask, your own voice. Think of yourself like an iceberg. Above the surface, what the world sees, your polished personality, your curated traits, the you that's been trained to perform. But below the surface lies the rest. The full spectrum of your humanity, your messiness, your contradictions, your truths. And if you've spent your life identifying only with the visible part, then the invisible part hasn't disappeared. It has only grown more autonomous, more urgent, more unpredictable. Because what is repressed does not vanish. It evolves. This is where the fracture occurs. The split between the self you show and the self you hide. And the longer this division remains unconscious, the more tension it creates within you. Eventually, that tension demands to be felt. You start snapping at people you love. You sabotage things that matter. You feel empty in moments that should feel full. And you wonder, why does this keep happening? The answer lies in what you've never faced. What you pushed down to survive now wants to rise up so you can finally live. But it's not just emotional, it's existential. Because to cut off parts of your psyche is to cut off access to your vitality, your depth, your authenticity. And here's the paradox. The shadow contains not only your repressed wounds, but also your repressed power. The passion you were told to suppress might be the key to your voice. The anger you buried might be the fire that fuels your boundaries. The grief you never let out might be the doorway to compassion. So the real question isn't, do I have a shadow? We all do. The question is, how much of your life is being lived in reaction to what you've never allowed yourself to feel? Because the shadow doesn't die in silence. It waits, it watches, and eventually, it acts. But what does that look like in real life? How does this buried part of you start to take control? Let's go deeper. The shadow's game, how it controls without being seen. The shadow doesn't scream. It doesn't knock on the door or demand your attention. It doesn't need to, because it already lives inside the architecture of your mind. Its game is subtle. Its influence invisible, but its effects unmistakable. You believe you're in control. But what if your logic is scripted, shaped not by clarity, but by a ghost you've never seen? Carl Jung warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Let's look at how that actually happens. One of the most common tactics of the shadow is projection. Projection is when we take a part of ourselves we can't accept, and we unconsciously assign it to someone else. You might resent the person who speaks with confidence, not because they've wronged you, but because their presence triggers something you've silenced in yourself, a desire for expression, a need to be seen. You might judge someone's ambition harshly, not because they're arrogant, but because somewhere along the way, you buried your own hunger for success. It was called selfish, or dangerous, or too much. So now, you attack it when you see it in someone else. This isn't malice, It's reflex. The shadow protects its secrets, even if it means distorting your view of reality. Another strategy is self-sabotage. This one is insidious. It's the job opportunity you accidentally miss. The relationship you ruin just as it's becoming real. The project you abandon at the finish line. On the surface, it seems like fear, but deeper down, it's something more complex. If your unconscious believes you don't deserve success, or fears the responsibility it brings, it will create accidents to keep you small. Not because you're weak, but because a buried part of you doesn't feel safe expanding. And then there's repetition, what we might call emotional echo chambers, patterns that loop again and again. You attract the same type of partner. You fall into the same conflict with friends. You repeat the same emotional script in new settings. Different faces. Sam drama. This happens because the shadow contains not just your repressed traits, but your unresolved emotional stories. And until you rewrite those stories, your mind will keep casting the same play with different actors. At this point, you may feel a strange discomfort, a recognition, as if you're beginning to see that parts of your life may not be as self-directed as they seemed. Because here's the truth. The shadow doesn't destroy from the outside. It writes the script. You just deliver the lines. You become the performer, acting out emotional roles written long ago before you had the awareness to question them. And the more unaware you are, the more faithfully you stick to the script. This is why change can feel impossible. Why you can know what needs to shift, but still feel paralyzed. It's not because you lack discipline. It's because a hidden part of you has never agreed to the change. You chase growth, but you're dancing on strings, and the puppeteer lives in your unconscious. Now, you might be asking, if all of this is happening behind the scenes, how can I tell if it's already controlling me? The answer is found in the patterns, in the emotional fingerprints left behind. Let's explore the signs, the unmistakable evidence that your shadow is no longer hiding, but leading. And you didn't even know it. Signs of possession when your shadow becomes you. So how do you know if the shadow has taken control? What does it look like when something you've never faced starts making decisions on your behalf? The signs are subtle at first, but once you recognize them, they're impossible to unsee. Let's start with one of the most common disproportionate emotional reactions. A minor comment sends you into a spiral. A small failure feels like personal ruin. Someone else's success fills you with silent resentment. This isn't overreaction. It's old pain disguised as the present. Not because you're irrational, but because you're carrying unprocessed pain that's been waiting for a trigger. Another sign, the repetition of self-defeating patterns. No matter how much insight you gain, for you keep ending up in the same place, the same broken relationships, the same career, dead ends, the same emotional roller coasters. It's not coincidence. It's not bad luck. It's not fate. It's the shadow, playing out an old emotional script and convincing you it's just how life is. Then comes the fear of judgment, not a passing concern, but a crippling fear of being seen as wrong, flawed, or exposed. So you censor yourself. You shrink. You become hyper-attuned to others' expectations, always calculating how to avoid rejection. And beneath all of it, a hollow ache, a quiet, persistent emptiness, even when things seem fine. Like something is missing, but you can't name what it is. This, too, is the shadow, the absence you feel, is the part of yourself you left behind long ago. Jung warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But let's go deeper. There's another layer to this, what psychologists sometimes call ontological shame. Not, I did something wrong, but I am something wrong. It's the feeling that you are defective at the core. It's invisible, but it governs everything. You might become the nice person, the one who never causes conflict, always smiles, always helps, and everyone loves you for it. But what they don't see is that behind that kindness is a desperate need to prove you're worthy, to hide the shame of not feeling enough. So your entire identity becomes armor, a performance to outrun the fear that if anyone saw the real you, they'd leave. And here's the most haunting part. After years of wearing that mask, you start to believe it is you, that the roles you play, the helper, the achiever, the peacemaker, are your true self. But deep down, something doesn't add up. You feel tired, disconnected, unseen, even by yourself. It's like living inside a house that someone else built, decorated by other people's values, lit by artificial lights, and never once stepping outside to feel the sun. This is what it means to be possessed by your shadow. It's not some dramatic takeover. It's a slow erosion of authenticity. You don't even realize it's happening until one day you wake up and feel like a stranger in your own life. Recognizing this isn't easy, but it's necessary, because what remains unconscious doesn't just stay buried. It acts, and it shapes your reality whether you're aware of it or not. So, the first step is awareness. The courage to admit, maybe I'm not fully in control yet. But if that's true, if the shadow has already woven itself into your behaviors, emotions, and identity, what happens if you keep ignoring it? What's the cost of never turning to face what's been quietly running your life? That's where we're going next. And the answer may not be what you expect. When the shadow strikes back, the cost of denial. What happens when you keep pushing the shadow away? When you bury it deeper, ignore the warning signs, and continue pretending that the darkness within you doesn't exist. It doesn't stay buried. The shadow doesn't fade with neglect. It ferments. It builds pressure in the unconscious until one day it erupts. And when it does, it rarely whispers. It screams, sometimes in the form of explosive rage that seems to come from nowhere, sometimes as addiction to food, substances, sex, achievement, anything to numb the pain you can't name. Sometimes it appears as anxiety attacks, depression, or strange physical symptoms medicine struggles to explain. These aren't just random disruptions. They're not symptoms. They're smoke signals from the part of you still on fire. Because what we repress doesn't disappear. It mutates into symptoms, dysfunction, or illness. This is the cost of denial. And it's not just emotional or psychological. It's existential. You begin to lose your sense of self. You smile, but you're dimming. You keep moving, but feel nothing shift. You win, but it doesn't heal. You show up every day wearing your golden armor strong, polished, untouchable, but inside that armor is a terrified child, screaming to be seen. This is the modern epidemic no one talks about. Burnout isn't just from overwork. It's often the slow suffocation of the authentic self. Social media intensifies this fracture. You curate an image. You perform confidence. You post highlight reels while privately drowning in isolation, resentment, or emotional numbness. And over time, something deeper begins to erode your connection to your own soul. This is what Jung would call depersonalization, a haunting state where you no longer feel real to yourself. You look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. You feel like you're living someone else's life, following someone else's script. You've become a stranger within your own skin. Why? Because every time you denied a feeling, rejected a need, silenced a truth, you stepped a little further away from your essence. And eventually, the gap becomes unbearable. You wake up one day and realize you've spent your entire life performing the version of you that others needed, and now you don't know who you really are. That's the true danger of the shadow left, unacknowledged. Not just emotional chaos, but spiritual exile. You don't just lose control, you lose yourself. And here's what's most tragic. Most people never realize what's happening. They blame their job, their partner, their circumstances. They change cities, change careers, change relationships, but the ache remains. Because the root isn't out there, it's within. And the longer you run from it, the louder it becomes. This is why we see successful people break down, why influencers collapse behind the scenes, why leaders self-destruct in private while shining in public. You cannot outrun your shadow. You can only confront it or be consumed by it. But here's the turning point. If the shadow can destroy, then it can also liberate. Because within everything you've rejected lies untapped power, wisdom, and clarity. The parts of you that were once buried in shame may now become the source of your deepest strength. And that's where Jung leads us next. Not toward more repression, but toward reintegration. Let's discover how. Integration, turning the darkness into power. If the shadow is not something to destroy, then what do we do with it? Jung was clear. You don't kill the shadow. You integrate it. Because everything that lives in the shadow, your anger, your fear, your envy is still part of you. It holds not only your repressed wounds, but also your repressed potential. That's why shadow work isn't about cleansing or purifying. It's about reclaiming. The goal is not perfection. It's wholeness. So, how do we begin? The first step is awareness. You can't change what you won't confront. So when a strong emotional reaction rises, pause. Don't suppress it. Don't act on it. Instead, ask, where have I felt this before? What is this emotion trying to protect? What part of me is speaking right now? This is called shadow, tracking the practice of tracing emotional responses back to their psychological origin. It takes time, it takes honesty, but it reveals patterns you've been repeating unconsciously for years. A powerful tool for this is reflective journaling. Write without filters. Then ask, what part of you still resents the world? What success stings because it mirrors a dream you abandoned? Put it down. Name it. Own it. Because once it's conscious, it becomes something you can work with. You can also try internal dialogue. Jung called this active imagination. Close your eyes. Imagine your shadow as a separate figure. Ask it, what do you want me to see? Why do you keep showing up like this? What have I been ignoring? Often, what responds isn't a monster. It's a wounded version of you. A child left behind, a voice never heard. When you give it space, it softens. You can even go further. Drop your fear. Give your shame a shape. Write a letter to the part of you you've always rejected, not to judge it, but to understand it, because the shadow isn't just darkness. It contains light, to what Jungians call the golden shadow. These are your dormant gifts, your unrealized talents, your hidden strengths. Many people repress their greatness as much as their flaws. They dim their light to avoid standing out, just as they suppress their rage to avoid being too much. But both the golden and the dark shadow are part of the same whole. Integration means embracing all of it. It's not easy. It's not fast. But it's the only path to inner sovereignty. This isn't transformation into someone new. It's remembering the self you buried to survive. And this is the shift. You stop fighting your shadow and start learning from it. You stop projecting it outward and begin owning it inward. You turn your darkness into fuel for insight, boundaries, creativity, clarity. This is what real transformation looks like. Not the absence of shadow, but the right relationship with it. So yes, the work is uncomfortable. Yes, it demands emotional honesty, patience, and courage. But what it gives you in return is power. Not power over others, but power over your own life. You become the author of your story, not the puppet of your past. You move from fragmentation to integration, from control to alignment, from survival to self-possession. And yet, as liberating as this path is, very few will ever walk it. Not because they can't, but because they won't. Because even when the tools are there, even when the awareness begins to rise, there's still one final resistance: fear of who they'll become if they stop hiding. And that's where we go next. The choice few will make. Most people will never do this work. They'll keep playing out the same old story, different faces, different places, but always the same invisible script. They'll chase success while sabotaging it. They'll crave connection while pushing it away. They'll wear the mask so long, they forget there was ever a face beneath it. But you stayed until the end. You listened. You looked into the mirror most people avoid. And that means something. It means you're not afraid to ask the question that terrifies the world. Who am I? Really? Underneath it all. So now, the real journey begins. Not with a grand transformation, not with some overnight awakening, but with a single act of radical honesty. Try this. Write down one thing about yourself you've always denied. One truth you've buried, judged, or hidden. Put it on paper. Look at it. Feel it. That's how the light gets in. Because what you've spent your life avoiding might be the only path to finally coming home.